Hello everyone, I'm Joey from Lock Props, and today I'm going to be challenging myself to see if I can make both of Inosuke's swords within 8 hours. But in case if I do not finish the swords within 8 hours, I do have to give them away to one of my subscribers. With Demon Slayer Infinity Castle coming out into theaters very soon, I wanted to see if I could build this before that ends up coming out. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, it doesn't seem too bad. We'll see. Okay, here we go. First, we're going to go ahead and print out the template. The way that my templates work is that you cut one side of the template and then you overlay it onto the other side to make sure that it's all lined up. Then we'll make sure to tape one side, we'll flip the template over and then tape the other side. We're going to keep continuing this process until the entire thing is connected. Next, I'm going to take my razor blade and I'm going to cut out the template. For these jagged parts, you can use an X-Acto blade if you need to. It's a tedious process, but once everything is cut out, you'll only have to do one template. For the body of the sword, we're going to be using 6mm EVA foam. I laid the template on top of the foam and then I traced it out with a Sharpie. I don't draw in the jagged edges yet, we're going to get to that later. I just have the lines connect so then that way when I cut it out, it's all going to be one piece because we're going to be shaving this down first before we cut out the jagged pieces. We're going to trace one side, then we're going to flip the template over and then trace it again. Reminder that this is two swords, so we got to do the same thing again. To make it easier for me to cut out, I'm going to cut out a block of the EVA foam out where the template is, so then that way I can focus on each piece. Now I began to cut out the blade's body. If you have seen any of my other videos, I typically will cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. This is because most of the time I'm going to be sanding it down afterwards, so this way it gives me a little bit of extra leeway. For the rounded end, you can use a bunch of minor cuts, or you can use the X-Acto blade to go around this. If you are going to follow along, I do recommend to have your blade sharpened before you begin this process. Now that we have all four pieces cut out, we need to use a support rod in the middle. I went to the hardware store and I picked up this steel rod. It's about 3/16 inch by 48 inches, so it's really close to 5mm in diameter. If you want something a little bit lighter but easier to cut, I would recommend an aluminum rod instead. I just had this from a stockpile. When we trace out the rod on this sword, we want to make sure that the rod is closer to the spine of the blade, because you don't want to have it be in the middle just in case if, let's say you're cutting out the jagged pieces, you don't want the rod to show. I typically leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of space from the ends of the blade. That way it never protrudes. I mark on the rod where I'm going to cut. This would be a lot easier if I had an aluminum rod, but I have a steel rod. So I have to revert to using this. I spend some time cutting it down. Then I make sure that the rod still has its curve. For this next part, I use my router. I make the depth of the router to be about 2.5mm. Before I use the router, I take a long piece of tape and I invert it and I tape it to itself. This way I can tape down the EVA foam and it doesn't move while I'm routing. Going slow, I started digging out the trench and staying within the Sharpie lines that we made from the rod. If you don't have a router, you can use your razor blade. By cutting at a 45-degree angle into the foam, but not fully going through, you can cut one side and then flip your piece around and do the other side and it will make this V groove cut. And that will make the trench for your rod. I put the rod in to make sure that it fits and it looks like it's good. But now I need to make the trench for the other side. So while the rod is in the trench, I use my heat gun to heat up the rod. Then I'll place the opposite side on top of it and it will make a little indent into where the rod is supposed to go. From that point, since I can barely see it, I'll use my Sharpie to mark out where it is. Then I'll use the router to cut that area out. And now I got to do the same thing for the other sword. If I go over something with this video and I only say it one time, just assume that I'm doing it for the other sword. So now that I have all the trenches made, I now need to start gluing these all together. I'll lay all four pieces down like I did before with the router, so then that way they don't move on me. And then I'll use contact cement to put 2 layers on the sides where the trenches are for both swords. You don't see it in the video, but I am wearing a respirator while I'm using this, so make sure that you're wearing a respirator if you use contact cement. I'm going to lay the rod into the trench and then apply my second coat. This way the rod has some contact cement and then that way it can glue onto the other side. When gluing it together, I start from one side and I bend the EVA foam back so then that way I can see where the trench is. Then I slowly start rolling it onto itself so then that way the rod will go into the trench easily. If you miss and you put the rod in the area where the trench is not supposed to be, you're going to have a lump on the side of your sword that you're going to see. Once I got to the very end, I started smashing it down, making sure that all the edges were completely sealed. You want to make sure that the edges are completely sealed because when you go to sand, you want to make sure that there's no gap. Because then all of the EVA foam dust will kick up from sanding it and will go into the gap, and then it will keep it from actually gluing to itself. Then you're going to have a gap in your seam on your sword and you're going to see that. Whenever I have to do something multiple times, please let me know down in the comments. Do you want me to go over it again, or do you want me to just say that I did it for both swords? Let me know. I want to make sure that I'm not boring you with giving you repetitive information. Now that everything's been glued together, there are going to be areas where the foam is going to overlap and will have a lip. So we're going to make sure that we take our razor blade and we're going to cut off the excess. Again, make sure that your blade is sharp when you're doing this. This way you can have the cleanest cut possible, and then that way you don't have to sand as much after. I had a little slip and I injured myself. Luckily it was a sharp blade and not a dull one. After cutting off all the excess lip, now we can go ahead and start sanding. Using the belt sander is going to make this a lot faster for me. I start off by cleaning off all of the sides, making sure that it's pretty even. But before I can start sanding down the edge, I have to mark it with the template so then that way I know where I'm supposed to sand. Going back to the template, I'll cut out this section of the template. So the template doesn't move around, I'll use pins to keep it in place. Using my Sharpie, I'll go ahead and make those lines around the template. Still, we're not going to mark out where the jagged pieces go yet because this is all going to be sanded down, so it'll just be pointless if we Sharpie it now. We'll take the pins out, we'll flip it over, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. To help protect the areas where we're not supposed to sand, I'm going to use blue painter's tape to go over where the Sharpie line was. Because when I start sanding, if I happen to go too far, the blue painter's tape actually does kind of protect it a little bit. If you get to the curve of the sword and you really want to get that area right here, I will typically pull on the tape very tight so then that way I can have my finger trail where the Sharpie line is. I'm sorry, that's the best way I can describe it. If you ever see painters for motorcycles make flames on the side, they'll use really thin pieces of tape and they'll do the same thing. They'll just make the tape really tight and they'll have their finger trace where it wants it to go. Kind of the same process here. Now we're going to start sanding with the belt sander. With this, I take my time, I don't rush it, and I don't go against it. I have the EVA foam go in the same direction as the belt sander. For this process, you can definitely use a Dremel as well. It's just going to take longer time if you use a Dremel. Also, when sanding down, we do not want to go directly into the handle. You just want to stop where the white cloth is going to be wrapping the handle. Even if there are lumpy areas, you can use an orbital sander or you can use sanding sticks to really even everything out. With the orbital sander, I went with 800 grit. Then I kept going until I felt like that all the divots were pretty much gone. After completely sanding it down, we're going to use the heat gun to shrink all the pores on the sword. You only have to go a couple passes with this, but this will help with sealing the foam and painting it. Now we can finally trace out the jagged pieces. We're going to grab our template, we're going to lay it back onto the sword, and then we're going to mark it with our Sharpie. For this, I make sure that I apply enough pressure to keep the template on there. I don't use pins again, because now that we're done with sanding, that pinhole is going to show when we heat seal it again. Goodness gracious, 3.5 hours in already. Using my X-Acto blade, I'll carefully cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. Take your time here, you do not want to rush this. Even though the clock is telling me to hurry up. If the piece didn't cut completely through, you can flip it around to the other side and actually see where you're supposed to cut in order for it to free up, and you can take the piece out. Now that we got this all cut out, we do need to clean up the edges a bit. The edges still have these little pieces right here, but you can clean that up easily by taking some sandpaper and just brushing it off very quickly. If there's still some of those fuzzies left, don't worry, you can use the heat gun to shrink those even further. You want to make sure that you also do it on the inside part of the jagged pieces. Now we have to seal it. So I'll take some of this armature wire and I'm going to poke a hole in the side of the blade right here. This is going to be okay because the white cloth is going to be covering this section, so I'm not too worried about that. Just make sure that you don't go too far down the sword, because still a little bit of metal shows at the bottom of the blade. Next, we're going to take it outside, and I'm going to spray 3 layers of Plasti Dip on this. Luckily, it was a day that was 82 degrees, so I didn't have to wait very long to apply the multiple coats. While I was waiting for the Plasti Dip to dry outside, I grabbed some white cloth that I got over at the fabric store. Rest in peace, Joann's. Using my fabric scissors, I'm going to cut out 2-inch length strips. I originally cut out 4 just to be on the safe side, but I actually only ended up using 2. The length of this, by the way, is 1 yard. I'm going to set the strips aside for right now because I'm going to get to that later. Now I have to prep my paint. I'm going to grab the Createx Colors The Wicked Color Gloss Black, as well as the reducer. I poured my paint into my dropper, and then I added about 10% of the reducer. I shook it up and I let that rest for about 10 minutes. This gloss black is going to be the base coat of the sword. Next, we're going to have like a dark steel color. So then I'm going to grab Createx Colors Quicksilver, add it into a cup, and then add more gloss black into it to make it darker, and then adding 10% reducer. So now we're going to take the gloss black that we made, and then we're going to start applying it onto our sword. If you don't have an airbrush, no worries. You can also use spray cans for this. I personally am just trying to get better at airbrushing, but it also eats into my time a lot more. When I'm applying, I found out that I kind of had to go in circular motions just to make it as even as possible. I almost forgot, but I didn't, but I went ahead and sprayed the gloss black onto the bottom of the handle. I put the armature wire back through the hole and I hung up the sword so then that way it can dry. Then I painted the other sword and I did the same thing. Now these are going to be the only times that I ever pause the timer on here, is when I have to wait for paint to dry and cure. I cannot tell you how many times I was impatient and I tried to get the paint to cure faster, and when I went to apply masking tape, it ended up ripping up the paint with it and I had to redo everything. So when I'm doing a layer of airbrushing, I let it sit for the entire night. As soon as I get back into the shop, the timer starts again. It's kind of the only compromise that I can do in these kind of situations. But the next day I grabbed the darker steel color and I put it into my airbrush. Then I began applying it over the gloss black paint. The gloss black underneath will help it keep its shine. So I sprayed both swords completely and hung them up to dry overnight again. So while I was waiting for them to dry, I thought I'd take this opportunity to dirty up the rags a little bit. I laid out the cloth, loaded up my airbrush with the gloss black paint again, then sprayed a light layer of black around the edges of the cloth. Since Inosuke is a wild person who pretty much lives in the wilderness, I doubt that the cloths around his swords are going to be clean. So this is a way to dirty them up a little bit. Now that it's the next day, the steel has fully cured, we can now apply the masking tape. Using Tamiya 6mm masking tape, I'm going to start taping off the very edge of the blade. Since I want this part to be exact the entire length of the blade, I will take the tape, then run along the edge of the blade, then I'm going to grab another piece of masking tape and butt it up against that piece. Then I'll peel away the original one that I had put down. Now I have a section that is open for paint that is exactly 6mm going all the way down the blade. I hope that makes sense. That makes sense to me at least. But with the tape that's left, I can now use the yellow frog tape and put that down so then that way I can mask off the rest of the blade. I also make sure that I cover up the jagged pieces as well. Now that the sword is completely masked off, I can now start painting the edge of the blade. Putting the Quicksilver paint directly into the airbrush, I just started layering it on. As soon as I felt like I had put a good amount of paint on there, but not enough that it starts dripping, I start taking off the masking tape. The reason why I immediately take off the masking tape is because I had left masking tape on my props before, and then it left this residue on it afterwards that I wasn't able to clean off. Then I had to sand down and paint all over again. So the soonest that you can take off the masking tape, the better. Just do it really carefully. And it looks clean so far. Now that I know that one sword is good, I do the same exact thing for the other one. I pause the timer and let the paint dry overnight. The next day, now we can work on the handle. It's the most simple handle I've worked on so far, so thank goodness. I just take a little bit of super glue and put a little drop of it on the underneath side of the blade. I layer the cloth on top of it, and then I'll use this accelerant to immediately cure the super glue. Now that it's set in place, I start wrapping the handle, making sure that it's just overlapping kind of evenly, but even if it's not completely even, it also works out too because it's kind of part of the character anyway. Because Inosuke has these little tie-offs at the end of his blade, we need to make that. So I take my scissors and I cut out a kind of a dart at the end of the cloth. I'll put it over the hole that we had made before, and then using the armature wire that I used before, I shoved it down, pulled it out from the other side, made my knot, and then I used the scissors to cut down the middle of that, so then that way it looks like there's two pieces coming out of it as if it was an actual knot. Now that we're in the final hour, we gotta finish up this last sword. Put the super glue down, making the wrap all the way around, making the knot, and then I'm done. With 48 minutes left, that's amazing. We can confidently say that if you have all the tools and all the materials, you can do this within 8-ish hours of actually being inside of a shop. And that is it. The timer is done. Luckily, I was able to finish this. Now, I do want to say, because I did make this template many years ago and I just used the same exact one, I want to be fair and also say that that template kind of took me around 45 minutes to make, which kind of leaves us with 3 minutes left. But I'm really excited with how these turned out, and I cannot wait to get the next challenge started. If you guys have a challenge for me, please be sure to make it fair within a certain amount of time, but be sure to comment it down below and I'll be sure to take a look and see what I might be able to do. But for the meanwhile though, I consider this a win. And if you guys wanted to get more Demon Slayer tutorials, I actually did make Shinobu's Blade, and I'm gonna go ahead and put that right here for you so then that way you can watch it now. If anybody else is excited about that movie, I am too. And I got tickets on September 11th.